Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And with a lot of busyness and stuff happening and also just being incredibly hot and humid in the UK, reading has been a little bit slower for me. But here are some of the books I've been reading this week, and I hope you're keeping well. First up, as I mentioned in my last weekly reads video, when I read Jenny Erpenbeck's other book, Visitation, here I read Go, Went, Gone, translated by, I think it's the same translator actually, Susan Bernofsky. And so I really greatly enjoyed this. I thought this was such a clever book. And although I think from what I've noticed so far from the 3 Jenny Erpenbeck books I've read, I think she does sort of play her cards fairly sort of openly, in the sense that quite early on she sort of lays out what she's going to do, the political point she's trying to make and the kind of metaphor she's going for. There's something really endearing about the way that she gets there and really powerful about the way that she tells stories, I think. And so Go, Went, Gone focuses on a different side of German history, and particularly a much more modern side of German history, particularly looking at immigration. And so we focused on this book on a few different characters, but particularly we start this book with looking at a local body of water where there is a human body that is in the water, and obviously this has sort of parallels with a lot of sort of boat crossings that have been happening for migrants recently, where particularly many have lost their lives. And this book uses that as a sort of to chart a bit of a progress of people leaving particularly North Africa to get to Germany. And in many ways as well, this also implicates Italy, because we sort of basically see firsthand the ridiculousness and sort of perilousness of the journey for many of these people. So if they do make the journey safely to Italy, that's the first place they're allowed to seek asylum, and the only place. And what that then means is they either have to stay in Italy for a certain amount of time, or if they are able to get to Germany, they still have to be able to go back to Italy every so often to get their card renewed and all these sorts of things. And this book really looks at the kind of cruelty behind a lot of that system, where there are people surviving on a few euros a day basically, and at various points in the year they might have to go back to Italy to renew their card, and how are they meant to do that on a few euros per day? And so this book really focuses on the heart of the human story of the migrant journey, and a big part of that, and particularly the kind of the implication of the title of the book, is then around what they do when they're learning German, or their kind of life there. So it looks at Go, Went, Gone, which like in English is a fairly irregular verb. And so, Go, Went, and Gone don't look massively like each other, and don't really look like the past tense used elsewhere, equally in German. And so the book kind of really focuses on the kind of, these migrants trying to learn German, suddenly realizing they don't even have the words to really describe the journey. And obviously the verb to go is particularly relevant for migrants talking about their journey. And so this book does quite a lot to kind of build this wider story about the sort of Germany and its modern day history, migrants and their journey, the kind of attempt at kind of acculturation and sort of moving into a new country and all of that kind of thing. And it does so sort of, I think, really beautifully. It's a book that keeps the human story here really beautifully, but I think also is not afraid to be a very literary and very political, punchy novel as well. So I really greatly enjoyed this, and I really appreciate, I think, from Jenny Erpenbeck's writing, just the ways that she's able to embed German history and Germanness into wider narratives, and I think this was a really great example of that. Next up, I read The Children's Bach by Helen, Garner, and I'm probably massively over-pronouncing Bach there. But anyway, so this is a sort of family drama, and sort of very domestic, kind of close-knit, tight family drama. And it's a really interesting book in several ways. It does that thing that I find really quite compelling, which is, typical household. Everything seems to be just about fine on the surface. Some new people get introduced and everything gets thrown out, and everything goes to sort of turmoil and tension and drama very quickly. just a very short book, a very tight, focused narrative about this family and how these things sort of fall apart. And the kind of recurring theme, hence the title of the book, is these the children learning piano, and there's sort of the various ways that little things that are endearing at certain parts of the book become incredibly frustrating later, right? So a child learning to play the piano at various points in this book can be both like, wow, well done, you, like you're doing really well, and also, will that child stop making this noise? And so I think this is a really interesting focused book. I kind of feel like I need a reread of it because I think a lot maybe went over my head in the first read, but I think it's a book that I would like to return to kind of get more of a sense, because it's one of those books where small things change, and that's, you know, a small detail is noted and that's everything, you know. A crumbling bit of wallpaper, or somebody, instead of saying something, nods their head, and that speaks volumes, and that sort of tight focused narrative. So I kind of want to give it another read and just really hone in on those details, but I think a really interesting and fascinating book as well. Next up, I read Loot by Tania James, and this is quite an interesting kind of quirky little story. So the core idea is that we have a young man who is a sort of famed, or becomes a famed sort of model creator. So he creates these sort of toys and little technical things. There's a much better term for this that my brain can't quite grasp right now. But yeah, imagine sort of somebody who makes little miniatures or little clockwork toys or those sorts of things. And he makes all of these and becomes sort of quite famous and quite known for them around the area and across the region. And all of this is one of those things that at the beginning of the book is sort of famed, you know, he's celebrated for it, but this becomes a thing of danger for him, because there's almost a target on his back, and almost you know, doing so, it means that he's now involved in the kind of the drama of the court and of kind of big political and sort of aristocratic figures who want to wield the power that he has, or kind of have that thing for themselves, and don't seem to understand that this is a very specific magical thing that he's created, and actually to just sort of give these away, it sort of starts to lose some of the magic of them. They're not just things to be traded. And so it's a really interesting, beautiful narrative, I think, and it has this sort of very old world feel in the way it approaches things that I found quite captivating. I will say, I think I maybe needed it to be a teeny bit more focused and sort of shorter, but I feel like I have that with most books, where I think a lot of books I'm like, this could be at least 10% shorter. But I still think this is a beautiful narrative, and there's something so wonderful about the magic of somebody talking about these toys and these contraptions and everything that goes into them, which never feels like it's laboured on a scientific and technical perspective. It always feels like it's still talking about the magic of a toy and this kind of animated thing for young people and for everybody. And last but not least, Long Live Queer Nightlife by Amin Ghaziani. And this is a book that is non-fiction and focuses a lot on the closure of lots of gay bars and LGBTQIA plus spaces across the world, but particularly in places like the US and the UK. And it sort of speaks more generally to what is happening kind of around that, what's the kind of ecosystem of it. And so it starts with a bit of a history of talking about how some of these spaces came to be and the importance of them at various points in history. So, you know, at times where being LGBTQIA plus was illegal and or was significantly less safe than it is now, those spaces were sort of were really sacred and important to make sure that a community had something. And he charts in this book the kind of the ways that we move closer and closer to many of these bars being closed, or many of the spaces being taken for granted, or even that, you know, we kind of tend to look at them as if these are spaces that aren't necessarily needed in some capacity. But what's also really interesting about this book, I think, is it does this thing of celebrating the joy that can come from these spaces, talking about the kind of euphoria and release and freedom and utopia that can exist in spaces like this, but equally how many of these spaces traditionally haven't also allowed parts of the community to be there. So he talks a lot in this book about how, you know, some spaces, particularly in the UK and US, are often ones that ignore parts of the community. So it's almost only white gay men, for example, who might exist in some of these spaces. And he talks about how parts of the closures can also be linked to that actually some of the base of people who could be there aren't there. And so it's just this really interesting book that I think just celebrates the joy of nightlife in a really interesting way. It's kind of, reading and nightlife feels so sort of opposite to each other in some ways. So it's quite interesting to be able to read a book that is so full of the love of this sort of vibrant nighttime culture as well. So those are the books I've been reading this week. Apologies, I realise I'm just sort of sweating increasingly as this video is going on. It's a very warm day, it's very humid. I hope you're keeping really well and having a good week, and that your day is less chaotic than my hair is. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.